Is this thing on? Yes, it is. It's very on. I'm going to turn myself down. Whoa, wind noise. All right. Can everyone hear me? Can anyone hear me? Am I audible? Good. Does this thing work? Hey, I have the power now. Slide. Oh, okay. I'll look at it. Alrighty, so we're going to get started just so that we can get out of the way of the London Spiritualist Church. So I hope you can hear me. So today I'm here to present some of the research that I've been doing at school over the last few years. And in particular, it's research from my undergraduate thesis, which I completed last year. So, oh, hello. So as you might know, I went back to school 4 or 5 years ago and took sociology. My first degree was in computer science, and I found the only thing that I liked about computer science was the stuff that had nothing to do with computers. I was more interested in the stuff about human beings, about human communities, and how technology influenced us as a society. So an overview of this particular presentation, I'd like to give you an understanding of what the world is like right now. And we obviously all have an understanding of what the world is like, but there are some things that are going on that not everyone is aware of 100% of the time. Although things quantitatively seem to be going great, GDP is up, poverty is down, everything seems to be going well, there is an undercurrent happening. People are more isolated and alienated than they've ever been before. It's a very lonely world, and so that could be draining. It's spiritually draining, emotionally draining, and we as a society are starting to fall apart. We're starting to see symptoms of that happening in the decay of democracy with the rise of people like Trump, that sort of thing. Obviously, this is not ideal. So we need to figure out a way to resist that. How do we resist against the process of alienation, of isolation? So this is what this study is about, is how do we find resistance? So the method of the church is to study an open-minded church community, i.e. Trinity. Here we are. How is it that we can use this model, the Trinity model, to resist the alienating effects of the neoliberal era? And what are the characteristics of our community that make this an ideal place? So, stop me if you heard this one. An atheist walks into a church and ... So this is me. I came into this place an atheist, and I still generally self-identify as an atheist. There are some specifics that I might get into another time, but what I found here was a community that resists that alienation, that isolation. And so when I was doing this study, I wanted to study Trinity because it's made such a big difference in my life. So I interviewed Paul as part of this process. I also had a focus group with a number of folks here who self-identify as Christians, as like traditional Christians of some sort or another. And I also had a focus group with some members of the Green Team, some former Christians, some people who identify as well as atheists and agnostics, some former Catholics, pagans, Wiccans, that sort of thing. So, Trinity United Church. You're all very familiar with Trinity. We are a part of the United Church of Canada. We are what I would consider an adogmatic organization. There's very little in terms of like hard and fast rules, things that you have to believe in order to be a member here. The only real rule is the golden rule, i.e. don't be a jerk. Do unto others what you would have done unto yourself. Be as kind and generous as you possibly can be. We're obviously also LGBT plus affirming. We have that as part of our core mission. And we also only have one rule, indeed, the golden rule. So how is it that I got here? I told the story in a sermon a couple of years ago, but basically it involved me as I was nominally Christian in high school, and then I fell away from the faith, citing logic, and things just didn't make sense to me. I fell away from the faith, and I ended up very isolated in my young adulthood and youth. And then when I came here and I found Trinity as a result of a chance encounter with Paul, I found it home. I felt for the first time I found a community that really supports me and accepts me for who and how I am. I can go into that story in detail later, but in the interest of time, we'll just move on. So what's the problem? Why is it that I feel the need that we need to solve a problem? Well, much as Jesus did, I'd like to tell a story in the form of a parable of the paperclip maximizer. Hello. So there's a mathematical relationship here. There's the difference between linear and exponential growth. So linear growth just looks like a line. It just goes up over time, and as time goes on, it gets just gradually faster. Versus exponential growth, which explodes off. With each time scale, it gets faster and faster and starts getting quicker and quicker in terms of its growth. So what we have here is right, okay, so the paperclip maximizer, say you've got this tiny little team of nanorobots, just tiny little robots that can make you whatever you want. And you tell it, make me as many paperclips as possible, as quickly as possible. And so this robot team gets to work, and it starts taking apart the pile of iron shavings that you provided it, and starts making paperclips out of it. But you didn't tell it when to stop, and you didn't give it any parameters in terms of what it should be considering raw materials. So before long, it takes apart the iron filings, but then it realizes the table's also made of iron, and I can make paperclips out of that. So it starts taking apart the table, and then it starts taking apart the building, and you realize that there's a problem here, so you try and stop it, but it doesn't recognize you as an authority. It recognizes you as a threat to its mission. So it takes apart you because you've got iron in your blood, and it turns you into paperclips. And by mid-afternoon, well, the entire planet gets turned into paperclips. So what just happened here? Well, obviously there was an error. This team of robots, we've told it that the only measure of value is paperclip manufacture. So anything that is outside the realm of what paperclip manufacture means is rendered meaningless, worthless, valueless. And so it doesn't enter into consideration into the logic of this machine. And so what went wrong here is your utility function is set as paperclip manufacture, value is set as just paperclip manufacture, and so the entire planet doesn't matter to this thing as long as it's making paperclips. And so this is what's called a utility monster. Rawr. A utility monster, it doesn't feel, it doesn't have any emotions, it doesn't understand the value of human life. All it understands is its utility function. So what's this parable mean? Why do I bring this parable up? Well, we have lots of examples of utility monsters in our society today. The one that I'd like to draw attention to, the main one, is capitalism as an economic system. Yes, capitalism has brought us many great things. We've been able to bring a lot of people out of poverty. We've had great technological innovations. But the value system of capitalism is just capital. It's just money. The only thing that really matters at its core, in its essence, is just the creation of money. So anything other than that, like human life, like human well-being, like the rainforests, like climate change, it doesn't matter to the logic of capitalism because the only thing that matters is capital. So the utility function in this case, I've got lasers, this is great. The utility function is maximize money creation. As a result of that, it creates these instrumental goals. So these are like strategies that are used by the capitalist function to create the capital. So one of those instrumental goals is to acquire resources. So that means acquiring raw resources by mining out of the ground, cutting down trees, but also those resources include labor. So your jobs, all of your work is a resource for this capitalism creature, this utility monster. Its other instrumental goal is growth, consumption. Maximize the amount of consumption possible and the amount of growth possible as quickly as possible. And also the other one is self-preservation. So that's when you try to stop that utility monster and it eats you. That's self-preservation. So I can also apply a self-preservation mechanism to capitalism. It's trying to protect itself when we try and control it. So if we try and regulate it using laws or using any sort of regulation, it will try to protect its goal by overcoming those regulations. So the strategy that it adopts here is to recruit and manipulate people's political agenda and their economic behavior. So you're incentivized to do things that are actually destructive to the environment, not because you want to, but because it's the only option. It's successful for you. If you, the cheapest car is going to be the one that's most polluting. So you, not having a lot of money, buy the cheap car because, well, it's cheap and it's effective. It does what it needs to do, but it's polluting. So there's consequences to that actions that you don't have direct control over. Now, how does it do this? Well, it does this by manipulating our sense of reality. It makes us understand reality in a different way than it actually exists. So this is based off the theorist C.B. Macpherson. He's a Canadian theorist out of the University of Toronto. He terms this possessive individualism. It's about the nature of being. Ontology is the study of the nature of being. So that includes many things, like what is a thing? How do you identify a thing? But that also includes things like, what is a human? What is human nature? What am I as a human at my essence? So there's lots of different ways of understanding what a human being is, and we understand a lot of those here as a child of God, as a creature, as a saint, that sort of thing. What the nature of humanity is under capitalism is homo economicus, as in economic man. You are rendered as an economic unit, a consumer. You may hear this on the news all the time, saying like consumer growth, consumer confidence. That's you. You're rendered into a consumer unit. And so there's all these mathematical equations happening. There's all these algorithms happening that are taking you, not as a human being, but as an abstract concept, as an economic unit. And so your individual values are then being rendered into consumerism. So the mechanism of this system makes it so that it's trying to optimize the amount of stuff that you buy, the stuff that you consume. And so this has lots of extensions, and it's changed over time, and I'm not going to go into the details in the interest of time, but what we now have is this idea that capitalism is the only way. It's become a realized concept. Yes, there's been alternatives over the past, and they've been wildly unsuccessful, disastrous even. But we now have this idea that we've reached the pinnacle of human civilization, the only and the best form of human organization that's possible, which I don't really believe to be true. I think that we could be doing better, and I don't have an answer necessarily as to what that better way is, but I think that we could start thinking about this. In the ominous words of Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, there is no alternative. But really, there is an alternative. But wait, there's more. The neoliberal era, it accelerated this growth of capitalism, this change to trickle-down economics, where we've had it fed into our minds that if you make the wealthy wealthier, then everything will trickle down to us and we'll get wealthier. It doesn't work. Study after study, all the records show that if you make the wealthy wealthier, they'll just keep their wealth, and we don't end up any better off. In fact, we end up worse off. This also robs us of our collective responsibility. We don't feel a general sense of responsibility to the rest of humanity. It's just individual responsibility. If you have a problem, well, that's your fault. If you have a problem, it's your fault. But no, that's not the way humans actually are. Also, individualism. We don't really even have a sense of self-identity. We can't really bring ourselves to identify as something other than a collection of commodities. What are you? Well, you're your job. You're what you subscribe to. You're what you buy. That's not what real humanity is. And of course, there's all these side effects, which, these aren't pleasant side effects. The erosion of social services, loneliness, isolation, exploitation, omnicidal madmen, people pointing nuclear weapons at each other for endless hours, people-less homes, homeless people. It's all a mess. So I can attribute all these things, I think, to capitalism at large. This is also based off the work of Johann Hari. He wrote this book called Lonely Spirits and Hungry Ghosts. as well as Lost Connections is the other book. I highly recommend both of those books. They explain the nature of the alienating state of our society and also explain addiction in a different way. Addiction isn't a matter of being hooked on a chemical, a drug. It's a matter of alienation and isolation. If you're lonely, you want the pain of that loneliness to go away, because loneliness is very painful. And most people don't have a family or a support structure or a community around them to get that alienation and loneliness to go away. And so drugs can anesthetize you from that pain. I'm going to skip through some of this just so that it moves along. Another one of the projects I did was indeed that addiction thing. You may notice that society has become very spectacular lately, very intense. You turn on the TV, everything's very loud, very flashy, very bright. The internet is just full of advertisements, and social media is just this endless stream of information being shoved at you. That can certainly affect the way that you look at the world, and that can be dangerous because it's feeding you a sense of the world that doesn't actually reflect real reality. And it's not a neutral platform. It's trying to manipulate you into buying things, into doing certain behaviors that benefits the wealthiest people. So yeah, just to summarize so far, just so we're all on the same page, capitalism as an economic system functions as a utility monster. Its goal is to maximize capital creation. And so absolutely everything that is in the logic of capitalism is to maximize that money creation at the cost of anything else. It doesn't matter what the other costs are. So the consequences of this are utilitarian rationalism. We're rendered into cheerful robots. We cheerfully go to work. We cheerfully do all this economic behavior in order to maximize capital. Inequality keeps going up. There's a creeping sense of malaise, loneliness, addiction. There's, of course, the looming environmental catastrophe, which if you're not worried about, you're not paying attention. And then, yes, paperclips. There's this nonsensical measure of value. So, how do we solve this problem? It's a big problem, obviously, and I don't have all the answers, but I've got a couple of suggestions in terms of what we might be able to draw clues from. So, what can we do? Well, there's that old phrase from Geddes, think globally, act locally. So think about these big problems, but also recognize you're not going to be able to solve them because they're big problems. So all you can really do is act locally. How locally? Well, this church is a lovely place to start. So there's two real solutions here. There's the individual problem. How do you solve the problem in your life, in your immediate sphere? And then there's the society level, where how do you build communities so as to be able to eliminate that loneliness, that sense of alienation. So what does this mean? Okay, well, first thing, on the individual level, we need ontological therapy. So what does that mean? That means therapy on the level of your understanding of reality. We have this very clear-cut sense that we're confident in the nature of reality. We think we know what reality looks like, but it's not really reality. It's just our perceptions of reality. And it's difficult to actually understand that reality out there isn't the same as what we're perceiving it as. It's comfortable to have confidence in reality, and it's very uncomfortable at times to recognize that that isn't necessarily trustworthy. So how can we do that? Well, we need to think of ourselves not as individuals, as isolated individuals, but as part of a collective. And I think we all recognize that here, in that we are part of a collective. We're part of a community here, but also part of a larger community. The City of London, the Province of Ontario, the nation of Canada, the globe, the entire world. We are part of this. Another one is supporting effective relationships. We are emotional beings, we're spiritual beings. We're not just rational economic units. We don't just have transactions with one another. We support one another. We strengthen one another. Also, autonomous moral reasoning. Paul's talked about this quite a lot, where over the centuries, the church has become this moral authority, where they set the rules, and you have to follow the attention of the guy with the big pointy hat. It doesn't work, because the guy with the big pointy hat doesn't necessarily have your best interests in mind. The guy with the big pointy hat might be being manipulated by an even higher power. Don't necessarily want to trust them. You need to make up your own mind. Hard and fast rules work for kids, but for you, adults, you need to think about things and make up your own mind. Now, the big one, though, is play. We need to be willing to experiment, to have the freedom of play and pleasure and, running around the church. That's a very important part. So I would encourage any of you to start running around as well. And also a big one that Paul talks about quite a lot is that sense of awe, agape, the sense of wonder that you can look up at the sky and be like, wow, I'm a part of all this. This is amazing. And we call that here wonder or spirit or mystery or God or magic or whatever you want to call it. It's all the same thing. It's just that sense that it is greater than me. I am part of something that is greater. So I did this case study here. I was talking to a bunch of people here. I talked to Paul. I talked to Dick and some other folks brought into a thing. So the themes that emerged from this, spiritual community mediates individualism and collectivism. What does that mean? So some cultures are very collectivist, such as like China's very collectivist versus North America's very individualist. We focus on the individual. Spiritual community brings that together. It recognizes us, or it reminds us in North America of our allegiance to the collective, whereas in a place like China, it allows the individual to recognize themselves within this collective. There's that mediation process that happens that's very important for us to recognize ourselves as social beings. Also, intergenerational social bonding. We see here, very rarely in our society, that we have generations of all levels working together and coming together. We have children here, we have adults here, we have seniors here. People from 8 to 80 are involved here. Also, we have a shared experience through the narrative. Not all of us are necessarily Christians, but we have this narrative, the Christian narrative, the narrative of Jesus, where every year we go through the same cycle. There's the birth story, there's the life, there's the Lent, there's Easter, and we just had Ascension, and now we're into the next phase of the Christian calendar. One of the great things also here is that we do abureaucratic social assistance, direct assistance to the people that need it, which is important because the bureaucracy of government can often deny people their needs being met because of certain preconditions, certain just little things that aren't necessarily, that shouldn't necessarily deny them of that right, but they do. We also here reject those values of consumerism, that everything is worthless. We do value things here. We recognize the value of community and each other here. We also encourage autonomous moral reasoning. We are given in a sermon some ideas, we're given inspiration, but we're also encouraged to make up our own minds. And also the big one, joyful volunteer labor. How many among you show up for hours and hours per month doing a job that otherwise would be paid, possibly minimum wage, but we willingly and gladly do it for free? And that's important. So what can we learn here? Well, in our largest society, we can regain our sense of nurturing and sense of self-worth in a place of society by regaining our connection to ourselves, regaining our connection to others, and to the world at large, by recognizing that we're part of something, but we're also something of ourselves. Also by immersing ourselves in social relationships, in effective support, in community spirit, that can really engage us to the sense that we're in this together. We're all working in one direction. There's also the emerging practice of what I call clinical sociology. We've all heard of clinical psychology, where someone will take care of an individual who's having a psychological problem. But what about clinical sociology? One of the projects here at Trinity is we're part of the apartment complex across the street, where there was at one point a very unhealthy social dynamic there. But as part of a grant through the city, we've got people working over there, trying to encourage social growth there, the growth of community, so that they can not just fight with one another, but actually work together, become a better place together. So where am I going with this? Well, there's much work left to be done, obviously. Sociology as a discipline involves the study of society, the study of relationships and the groups of people coming together. And so there's lots of different components to sociology. There's the empirical study, as in measuring things using statistics and surveys and things like that. But the work that I'm now doing is more theoretical in nature. Yes, it's important to have numbers that we can actually operationalize and do stuff with, but I'm more about the stories, about the theories, about making observations about the larger world and then thinking about them, figuring out why things are the way they are. Because I think why is the most important question here. And as soon as we understand why, then we can start to make sense of how to change things, how to move things in a more positive direction. So I'd like to do more study. I'd like to find out more about the cross-cultural nature of this. Because obviously this is a Christian community, but I'd like to see what it's like in a Muslim community or a Buddhist community. Or what can we do for the people that don't subscribe to a certain religious tradition, spiritual tradition. One of the neat things about Trinity is that some of the most valued members of our community never show up on Sunday morning. They're part of the green team, they're part of the AA groups, they're part of all the different things that happen in this building as part of this community. They're not necessarily self-identifying as Christians, but they are part of our community. I would consider here Trinity to be a community of communities, a meta-community, if you will. So I'd like to work here towards a generalizable praxis. Praxis is a combination of theory and practice. So I would like to understand how we do this, why we do this, and how to implement it in the greater world. How can we create communities like this elsewhere in London, elsewhere in the world? How can we take what we've learned here, the pro-social attitudes that we have engendered here, how can we apply that more generally in the rest of the world? The next thing is the effects of cultural narrative, and that's what I'm working on right now, is how does the narrative that we tell as a society affect the way that we think of ourselves and about society? So I'll present about that maybe in a couple of months or something like that if there's interest. Also the practice of ritual, prayer, consciousness alteration, and my particular interest is in psychedelic drugs. So things like LSD or magic mushrooms or things like that. They're different from other drugs. We think about like cannabis or alcohol as a drug. They have an anesthetic effect. They reduce the level of sensation. Versus these other drugs like magic mushrooms, which have a pro-aesthetic effect. They can actually bring on something that feels like a spiritual experience, a religious experience. And my first religious experience was under the influence of magic mushrooms in the park over across the street. And that's actually what brought me here. That's what actually gave me this spiritual impulse that let me know that I need church, that I understand that there is a value to this experience of spirituality. And also, like, magic is a thing. It's not the way that we think of it, like Harry Potter or whatever, but there is a magic here. We put out into this community a force, and from that force we then gain the benefit of what we put in. So we've got something really powerful here. We've got the potential to really change the world from the very center here in London, Ontario. So I appreciate you having interest in this. Just to summarize what I've talked about here, late modernity, the age in which we live, it feels less like the city of the future with our flying cars and jetpacks and stuff, and more like a boring version of a dystopia. It's rife with addiction, depression, anxiety. But those things are not a personal phenomenon. It's not about a problem with you that you need to take drugs or do therapy to solve. It's actually a problem largely with the larger world. It is an alienating and depressing world, so having an experience of that is actually quite understandable. The thesis of this work is that the church is a balm for that social ill. This is an island in which you can find peace, where you can find connection with one another that can resist that alienation and feed your social self. And of course, it's never too late to change course. And I mean that both individually on the community level and on the globe. We are on a less than ideal trajectory, to say the least, what with the rise of Trump, the issues with global warming. But we can still make a difference. We can still change the world here. And we just need to remember there's more to life than paper clips. It's more than just the value of money. There is a value in society itself and in being as part of a community. I'm open to questions if anyone has any. No? So So yes. Yes. So right now what I'm working on is my master's thesis. So it's probably going to be like 80, 90 pages or something like that. So a small book, but it's going to include this research as well as the stuff that I'm doing about narrative right now, as well as some things about the sensory overloading nature of our society, as well as the stuff about psychedelic drugs that I'm also interested in. So yeah, it's an ongoing process. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm dealing with some big emotions.
Yes,
Right now.
that's.
As you're talking about, commercialism and all of those things, are you planning on kind of, or have you already dove deeper into, artificial intelligence, big data, and algorithms, and how we're getting driven into that demanding consumerism?
Yeah, yeah. So the question, if you didn't hear, was about the role of algorithms, of computer systems that are driving this forward and influencing the way we feel. And yeah, that's the big one right there. And it's a topic of its own, which is why I didn't touch on it all that much. But basically what the age that we're living in, we have this idea of the world being taken over by evil robots like the Terminator. But I would hold that the robots have actually already taken over, and we didn't even notice it. Because you look at, like if you're on YouTube or something like that, and you look at the recommended videos list, who's making that recommended videos list? Who has decided that this is what shows up on your social media feed? Who's decided what's on the TV when you turn on the TV and you watch the news? Who's decided what's on sale at the local Best Buy or something like that? Well, that's a robot. There's an algorithm behind that. All of Amazon's supply chain, all of Walmart's supply chains, those are all managed by robots. There's no actual human intervention happening there at all. So the influence of these robots on our lives, it's incalculable, and also it's invisible. And if we're not thinking about these things, we may be influenced without our knowledge. So it does require a lot more thought. Anybody else? All right, well, I'll get out of the LSC's hair. But yeah, basically where I'm going with this is indeed the narrative stuff. And so if anybody's interested, I'm happy to take any more questions afterwards or later. And also I'll probably do more of these. And if there's interest in the fall, maybe I'll also start like a reading group where I can provide some basic literature and we can just talk about it. Yeah, you're into that? Cool. All right, well, thank you. Oh, yes, yes. Yes. Yeah, I'm recording it. Hello, Internet. Some of my writing is up there. So if you want to read some of my essays, certainly you can have a look at that for sure. Awesome. Well, thank you all very much for sticking around. Thank you.